1 minute ago. What began as a routine trade discussion between two world leaders has exploded into one of the most heated diplomatic confrontations of the decade. Moments ago, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi publicly slammed British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, accusing him of colonial arrogance and a trade war. The statement came live from New Delhi, and within minutes, social media erupted. British markets trembled and diplomats across London scrambled to contain the political firestorm. For weeks, quiet tension had been building behind closed doors. Starmer's new trade proposal, described by Labour insiders as a bold reset with India, was anything but bold to Delhi. The plan included strict tariffs on Indian tech exports, a demand for British oversight in manufacturing regulations, and a clause that essentially allowed the UK to veto certain Indian industrial subsidies. In simple terms, it was a blueprint for economic control dressed up as a partnership. When details leaked, Modi's government was furious. For India, this wasn't about numbers, it was about dignity. A nation that once lived under British rule was being told again what it could or couldn't produce. And Modi, ever the symbol of India's assertive rise, would not stay silent. In a fiery statement outside Parliament, Modi declared, "India does not bow to those who still think in the shadows of empire." The crowd roared. The line was replayed across every Indian channel. In the UK, however, silence. Starmer's office issued no response. At least not at first, but inside Downing Street, aides were panicking. Trade negotiators warned that a collapse in talks could cost Britain billions in post-Brexit exports, yet Starmer doubled down, insisting the UK must set higher ethical standards for trade. To India, those words sounded like hypocrisy. Ethical standards from a nation still grappling with its own political scandals, economic crises, and royal controversies. The Indian media tore the phrase apart overnight. Hashtags like hashtag Modi versus Starmer and hashtag New Empire War dominated global feeds. Indian commentators framed it as the rebirth of colonial defiance, Britain clinging to power it no longer had. And then came the laughter. At a press conference in Delhi, a journalist asked Modi whether he feared a trade war with the United Kingdom. Modi smiled, paused for a moment, and said simply, "Trade war? My friend, wars are fought between equals." The room erupted in applause. That single line hit harder than any sanction. In London, it was humiliation. The Prime Minister's press secretary struggled to contain the fallout. Financial papers described the comment as a diplomatic dagger. Even the palace was rumoured to be uneasy. King Charles reportedly asked aides for a briefing on the crisis, worried about the Commonwealth implications. Behind the scenes, Labour MPs began turning on their own leader. Some accused Starmer of reigniting anti-UK sentiment across Asia. Others whispered that he was out of his depth in global politics, a lawyer trying to play empire. Even Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, was said to be deeply concerned about the market reaction. The pound began to slide. Investors pulled out of Indian ventures, and the British media, once loyal to Starmer's narrative of steady leadership, began to shift tone. Headlines turned brutal. Modi laughs as Starmer falters. But the storm wasn't just economic, it was moral. Across Britain's Indian diaspora, voices rose in an anger. Community leaders accused Starmer of treating India as a junior partner, not a sovereign equal. In Birmingham, Manchester and Leicester, protesters gathered, waving both Union Jacks and Indian flags, chanting, "Respect India, respect the future." Meanwhile, in India, Modi's popularity surged even higher. The image of a strong leader standing tall against old Western pressure became a national symbol of pride. Indian commentators described it as the moment Britain realised it no longer ruled the global game. And yet the real danger was only beginning. Intelligence insiders leaked that both governments had quietly suspended diplomatic back channels. Trade advisors were recalled. Flights for a scheduled UK delegation were abruptly cancelled. One official was overheard saying, "We're witnessing the death of the Commonwealth spirit." By the end of the week, relations were in freefall and still neither side blinked. Modi refused to apologise, Starmer refused to retreat. What began as words was now spiralling into policy. London was preparing sanctions on Indian data firms. Delhi was threatening to block British imports. In retaliation, the global press called it the new economic Cold War. The question now haunting every corridor of power in both nations: who will flinch first? As Britain's influence crumbles and India's confidence rises, one question remains hanging in the air. Has the sun finally set on Britain's global power, or is Modi about to push it into permanent darkness? Inside Downing Street, the mood was grim, the blinds were drawn, aides whispered in corners. Keir Starmer sat at the head of the long, polished table, eyes sunken, jaw tight, as his security advisor read the latest intelligence briefing aloud. India had officially frozen all trade consultations and withdrawn its delegation from London. Across the world, headlines painted the moment in the harshest light. Modi defies Britain. The empire finally falls. India stands tall. UK scrambles. The symbolism was unbearable for a government already struggling to maintain control. Post-Brexit trade deals had been Starmer's lifeline, his promise to rebuild Britain's global role. But with India's sudden defiance, that promise was shattered. The narrative of a global Britain had turned into a tragic irony, a former empire now begging for deals it could no longer dictate. Inside the cabinet, tempers flared. Rachel Reeves accused the Prime Minister of provoking a superpower for the sake of moral posturing. David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, warned of economic isolation. Even some loyal MPs began calling the crisis Starmer's Suez moment. A humiliation echoing the 1956 collapse of Britain's global dominance. Meanwhile, in India, Narendra Modi was everywhere. The Indian press turned the diplomatic rupture into a national festival of pride. Television channels replayed his line, "Wars are fought between equals," every hour. Crowds chanted his name in Delhi, Mumbai and Hyderabad. Social media flooded with memes of a roaring lion standing over the crumbling image of Big Ben. The message was clear. India was done being lectured. But behind the triumph, Delhi's corridors of power were cold and calculating. Modi's advisors met in secret to discuss the next move. Economic retaliation. They began drafting a plan to restrict British companies' access to India's booming tech market. Vodafone, Barclays and Rolls-Royce all risked massive losses if the Indian government pulled the plug. It wasn't just politics, it was payback. Back in London, the British establishment began to fracture. The City of London, that ancient heart of British finance, turned against its own government. CEOs demanded Starmer end the feud. Immediately, markets dipped further. The pound hit a 6-month low. Even King Charles was drawn into the chaos, reportedly urging Starmer during a private audience to preserve the dignity of the realms. But Starmer refused to yield. He told his advisors, "Britain cannot afford to be seen bowing to foreign intimidation." It was a line that sounded noble in theory, but disastrous in practice. Across social media, the backlash was brutal. Influencers mocked Starmer's defiance as stubborn arrogance. Indian diaspora leaders appeared on talk shows demanding an apology. The BBC's political editor described the moment as the deepest collapse in UK-India relations since independence. And then came the leak. Late one evening, an anonymous document surfaced online. It was marked confidential, UK Trade Office. Inside were explosive notes from a meeting weeks earlier, allegedly showing that Starmer's inner circle had planned to limit India's market dominance and retain control of key technological sectors to prevent a global power imbalance. The phrase retain control was enough to ignite fury. To the Indian public, it sounded exactly like what Modi had warned of, a new form of colonial control disguised as diplomacy. By midnight, protesters had gathered outside the British High Commission in Delhi, waving signs that read, "Britain still thinks it rules us." Starmer's government went into lockdown. Press conferences were cancelled. No one spoke publicly for 48 hours, a silence that in the modern world is death. The outrage only grew louder. In Parliament, opposition voices tore into the Prime Minister. Nigel Farage appeared on live television calling Starmer the most tone-deaf leader in British history. On social media, the trending tag, #BritainFalling, became an international phenomenon. Meanwhile, Modi stood calm, even amused. At a rally in Gujarat, he told supporters, "When we were weak, they called us partners. Now that we are strong, they call us threats." The crowd thundered in applause. That clip alone racked up 50 million views overnight. For India, this was not just politics, it was poetic justice. For Britain, it was the slow, painful realisation of a changing world order. As the days passed, whispers of retaliation turned into action. India began quietly shifting defence contracts to France and Japan. Trade deals once earmarked for London were redirected to Singapore, and yet Starmer still believed he could salvage his image. He prepared a bold public address, a speech meant to steady the ship, to remind the nation that Britain would not be bullied by any power, east or west. But when the cameras rolled, the speech fell flat. His voice trembled. His words sounded hollow. Commentators called it a man trying to act powerful in a world that no longer believes him. That night, even the loyal British press began to turn. Newspaper headlines screamed, "Modi laughs, Britain bleeds." The fall of the empire, how Starmer lost India. And in living rooms across the UK, ordinary citizens began asking a question their leaders dreaded. If Britain can't command respect abroad, can it even command faith at home? The storm was far from over, because as Britain struggled to regain its footing, a secret message was making its way across diplomatic channels, one that would threaten to shatter what little trust remained. What shocking truth was hidden inside that encrypted transmission? And could it expose the real reason this crisis began in the first place? The final act of the crisis began in silence. It was late evening in London when the encrypted message reached number 10. The Prime Minister was in his office, surrounded by a small circle of advisors. The message was brief, 6 lines written in coded diplomatic language, but its meaning was unmistakable. India had discovered something that, if made public, could destroy what remained of the UK's global credibility. The leak came from within Britain's own Trade and Intelligence Division. It revealed that months before the dispute began, Starmer's administration had secretly authorised surveillance on Indian financial networks under the pretext of trade risk monitoring. In other words, British intelligence had been spying on Indian business data.